Hi, welcome back to Christine's Home Affairs. Today we are going to make a basket or some kind of a storage container with handles, and we're going to have a decorative feature of piping around the handles and the rim of the basket. A viewer by the name of Colin from the Isle of Wight, if I've got that correct, has asked me to do more projects using my vintage sewing machine. This is a Penick. It's a beautiful machine. A man gave this to me after his wife passed away. It wasn't working. I've cleaned it up and got it going, and it really works a treat. So today's video is going to be done on this. I've only used it a couple of times, so we'll see how we go. Anyway, stick around and we'll work on this project together. Here are all the things that we're going to need. This fabric here is my lining. It's 14 inches by 14 inches, and I think you'll find the outer bag very handy. It is also 14 inches by 14 inches. I want to stabilise this because I want to have a really stiff storage caddy. I'm actually using the decorative, so that's very, very stiff. It's not overly thick. It'll be easy to sew. But I've got some decorative that is 13 inches by 13 inches square. I've fused that to the wrong side of my outer fabric. So I've given myself a 1/2 inch seam allowance all the way around. So if you wanted to go and make this in a larger or smaller size, choose whatever square you're going to have. Make your decorative or stabiliser 1 inch smaller than the overall square size of your fabric. For the handles, I'm going to use hand fabric for handles. How cool is that? I have got 2 strips that are 14 inches by 4 inches, and I've just taken that from the excess fabric that was on the piece that I cut off. So I've got 2 handles 14 inches by 4 inches, and then I've got a couple of strips of fabric that are 1.5 inches wide. I don't know yet how much we need because we want that for the piping on the handles and around the base. And we also want some cord for piping between 1/8 and 1/4 inch thick. So we want some cord and some 1.5 inch strips of fabric. The first thing we're going to do is join our strips of fabric together so that there is less bulk. I like to overlap them like this. I also like to leave a little bit hanging out at the top and bottom. It actually helps me use that as a guide as to where I need to sew. I'm just going to place my ruler from one point to the other, and that line that I've drawn here is my stitching line. And once we've stitched that, open it out, you've distributed the bulk of the seam right across a few inches. I'll quickly go and sew that together now. So I've sewn my strips together on the diagonal here, and I need to cut off this excess here, but the first thing I want to do is flip my fabric over, just finger press that across the seam there, and you can see that that seam is distributed right across that width of fabric there. When it's folded across, there's going to be a minimal amount of bulk in the seam. This excess needs to be cut off. Just a little tip, before you go and cut off this excess fabric, you need to actually finger press the seams open. It's much easier to press the seams open when there's a little bit of fabric to play with. So if you trim them first, it's a little bit awkward getting your fingers in there. Finger press that, then you can bring the fabric back together again and trim it. Then your seams will press open much easier. Now we're ready for our piping cord. So rather than cut different lengths of piping and wasting fabric and cord, I'm going to do the piping and the fabric all in one continuous strip. Place your piping in the center of the fabric on the wrong side, fold the wrong sides together, and we're going to take this to the machine and stitch just like you would with a zip. So you can use your zipper foot if you want to, but we're going to stitch close to the edge of the piping. There's no need to go and fold this and clip it together. You can do this at the machine. So let's go and do that together now. It doesn't matter whether you have the raw edges to the left or to the right. I'm choosing to go with the right because you can see on my presser foot here, the left side is wider and the right side is narrower. I want to try and get as close as I can to the cord. So I'm running the presser foot along the edge of the cord here, and that will stitch in the middle there somewhere, and then I've got all that excess on the other side. So I'm using the side that's got the least amount of interference, I guess, closest to my cord. If the foot were the other way around, then I would just flip the piping over to the other side. And away we go. I haven't done the entire amount because I don't know how much I need yet, and rather than wasting time and fabric and cord, I'm just going to work with what I think I need at the moment. I can always continue if I need to do more. Now that we have some piping ready, we can take the fabric for the handles, and we're going to fold that in half lengthwise, bring the raw edges in, and then we'll fold those folded edges together, and I'll clip it in place for now. I'll take the other handle and we'll do the same thing. Okay, once we've got our handle fabric ready, we can go back to our piping fabric, and this raw edge here, we're going to tuck to the inside of our handle fabric. So we've got our piping slipped inside the layers of fabric there. We can go now and sew all the way along this long edge here. Once we've done that, come around and stitch down the other long edge. I would stitch the ends just where the cord is, just to keep it in place so that it doesn't accidentally slip out. And with the second handle, just attach it straight to the very end there in the same manner, and then you can continue on all the way to the end. Just saves a little bit of time. Once you've attached the piping to the handle fabric, just double check that you've got the same amount of piping peeking out on both sides, because we want our handles to be nice and even when we go and stitch this in place. When you're stitching, if you have the top layer up too high and the back too low, you may not catch all of the layers. You just want to double check that that's evenly distributed on both sides. Also, when we go and sew this, rather than stitching right on the very, very edge there, I'm going to come in about 1/8 of an inch. That'll make sure I actually catch all of the layers. So take it to the machine, sew both long edges, and we'll just stitch the cord in place at the top and bottom ends. And for the same reason as before, I'm going to be stitching on the narrow side of my foot. So that's made a nice decorative feature of the handle. We can trim off the excess. We'll set aside the rest of this piping fabric, and now we're going to attach the handle to each side of our bag. This square is 14 inches across, so I'll find the center point, which is 7 inches, and from there you can determine whereabouts you want to put your handle. Depending on how long they are, you might want them further apart so that it makes it a shorter handle, or you might want them closer together to make a longer handle. Or you can just go and trim the handle to a different size if you want to. That's my center. I'm going to position my handle 2 inches either side of the middle. So I've got the center, then 2 inches to the right and 2 inches to the left. I'm going to have my piping fabric facing the outside. Doesn't matter which way you go, it's completely up to you, but whatever you do, you want to do the same at both ends. So the handle has been positioned to the left side of that marking that I've made. When you place your handle, just make sure there's no twist as you come around. So the piping is on the outside all the way. Flip it around and do the same thing at this end. Mark the center point and then 2 inches on either side of that. Take the other handle and do the same thing. Place your piping on the outside edge, or if you want to, you can place it on the inside. Okay, so that is our handle in position. What do you think? Do you think that piping is going to add a nice little decorative feature? I like it already. I'm going to sew all of these handles in place now. I won't take you with me. We all know how to do that. So just stitch across there. My seams for this project is a 1/2 inch all the way around. So as long as your seam is less than 1/2 inch, just go 1/4 inch. Backstitch a couple of times to secure your handles in place. With our handles in place, turn your fabric upside down, find the center again, but this time we're going to find the center of the stabilizer that we've used. So this is 13 inches across, half of that is 6.5 inches, and we're going to make a boxed corner, and we want to decide how big a boxed corner we want. What do I want? Okay, so I've had a bit of a think about what I want here. I want to have a finished boxed corner of around about 4 inches across the bottom. So with my center marked here, I'm going to come out 2 inches on either side. And we also have to keep in mind that we need to allow for a seam allowance. So our seam allowance, being 1/2 inch, will be on the inside there. So I've measured 2 inches outside of the center, and then I'm going to measure 2 inches from the side edge of the decoville. And if you just bring that line straight down to the other end, measure out 2 inches from the edge of the decoville, so we've got 2 inches here, 4 and 2, that being the center, and same here, 2, 4 and 2 inches along there. And I'm just going to mark in the seam allowance so that you can see where our stitching line is. So our cutting line is the 2 inches, and the stitching line is that pink line, which is 1/2 inch all the way around. And that will allow for that same 1/2 inch seam allowance that we've got around the entire square. Now, when you're deciding what size bag you want to make, if you're happy with the dimensions on the inside of the bag, and you'll see that soon when we box it all up, you can actually use exactly the same dimensions here and just add, if you wanted a bag that was 1 inch higher, you would add 2 inches. If you wanted a bag that was 3 inches higher, you would add 6 inches, because you need to have that allowance on the sides. So you would increase your fabric in that way and keep your boxing the same. I'm going to place my lining fabric and my main fabric together. That way I can cut out the boxed section all in one go. So with my lining and my main fabric lined up evenly underneath, I'm going to cut out the grey section, not the pink section that needs to be stitched. I nearly did that wrong. I was just about to cut. Oh no, I cut the pink. I said not to cut the pink section. I've accidentally cut the pink section, so I'm going to do a repair on this and still use it as is. I don't want to have to go and cut another piece of fabric. That was silly. I said not to cut the pink section and I went and cut the pink. Because I need to, what I'm going to do to repair this, I wouldn't sell this as is, but I'm going to use this for myself, so it's okay, I can live with it. What I'm going to do is just pop some double-sided tape over there, and I'll grab some of the lining fabric because it's lighter than the outside fabric, and I'm going to just make a patch and stitch that on there. I will just sew around there, make sure that's nice and secure, and then I'll be able to box my corners as I needed to. Likewise on the lining fabric, I've done the same thing. I've just got some double-sided tape along there. I'll place the fabric that I've cut out from here and I'll just stitch around that rectangle to secure it, and then we are back in business. Okay, so crisis averted. I have just gone and sewn a patch to the wrong side of the lining, which you won't notice, and also to the wrong side of the main fabric. That one you will notice, but I've put it in place, and when this bag is finished, it's going to be sitting underneath, so nobody will ever notice. And as I said, I'm going to keep this for myself. Very stupid thing to do, but very easy to happen. Now, let's get back to it. Take your main fabric, place right sides together with the handles facing, and we'll line up the side seams, clip it together. Okay, lining has been clipped together on the edges here. The main has also been clipped together, and we're just going to go and sew along those side edges. Not along here yet, just along the outside edges on both pieces. With our side seams finished on the main and on the lining, we can take our main fabric now, bring the side edge into the centre of the bag, and you can see that that will form a nice straight line going across there. Because we've measured that 1/2 inch all the way around, we've got a 1/2 inch seam here. We've measured our box corner from the decorative, come down, and we've measured our seam around here. This is now going to open out and line up really nicely. I'm going to open my seams just to make it easier to distribute the bulk when I do the piping shortly. And that pink line that we drew earlier, which is our 1/2 inch seam allowance, we're going to sew straight across there. Do the same on the other side, open that seam allowance, and we'll stitch across there on both sides. So you can see this taking shape now, can't you? And we'll do the same on this one here. Open out your lining. It's only lightweight fabric, so it doesn't really matter if you don't want to press your seams open, but I like to do the same thing on both pieces of fabric. So if I press them open on the outer, I'll press the seams open on the inner. Okay, we'll go and sew those together now. Because I'm using Decaville, I'm actually going to go over this seam twice just to give it some extra strength. Now it's time to attach the piping to the edge of our bag. Doesn't matter where you start, but I will start where the side seam is, and I'm just going to overlap that bit of cord on the side seam, and I'll start clipping that in place. And just to get started, I'm going to take this to the machine now I'm not going to start sewing right on the very edge. I'll start sewing where that seam line is. Rather than stitching where that stitching line is at the moment, I just want to basically secure this in place so that I can drop my lining in shortly. I'm going to just sew about 1/4 of an inch all the way around. Remember, I'm going to start in a little bit, right at the seam. So I've left about just over 1/2 an inch or so. We'll continue to sew all the way around, and I'll show you what we're going to do when we get to the end. So because the decorative is so stiff, it will be a little bit difficult to manoeuvre around, but we'll just see how we go. Normally you would do this whilst you're at the machine, but it's going to be much easier to show you what to do on the table here. So this is where I started sewing, and I've got my cord on the inside here, and this is where I finished sewing. So I finished sewing before the raw edge here, and I've also removed the last few stitches on the piping that we did earlier. We can open that out, and this little bit of piping here, we don't need that, so line that up with the edge of your piping here, and we can trim that back. Only need to take a small amount off, and that lines up with the piping underneath. And this raw edge here, we're going to fold that up once, about 1/4 of an inch. Fold it back in half again, and then this section that we started with is just going to sit inside there. And then we just need to sew this section closed. Once you've done that, you're going to have no raw edges showing on your piping at all. Rather than taking you back to the machine, I'll just quickly go and stitch that section closed. So that's closed up nicely there, and you can't see any of the raw edges from the binding fabric. Leave your main bag inside out, take your lining, and we're going to place that right side out. So we want to have the nice neat edges facing the inside of the bag. Find your side seam, and then you can start lining up the fabric and clipping it together. So we'll do the side edges first. Make sure your handles are on the inside, and then evenly distribute that lining fabric all the way around and clip it in place. Okay, this is now ready to be sewn all the way around. Doesn't matter where you start, we need to leave an opening somewhere in the top section for turning through. So what you'll do is start sewing around about here, back stitch, come all the way around, stop a few inches away, so leave about 4 inches because the decorative is quite stiff, even 5 inches, and then back stitch at the end. What I'm going to do, because I like to be able to see a stitching line so that the fabric will fold underneath nice and evenly, I'm actually going to do my back stitch, come all the way around, come to within about 5 inches from the end, back stitch, and then continue on sewing. Then I can finger press that seam and undo those stitches. Let's go to the machine and close this up. I've popped a magnetic seam guide onto my machine just so that I can easily sew that 1/2 an inch seam allowance. I've had to move over to my industrial machine because the other machine doesn't have a 1/2 inch guide on the stitch plate, and I need to make sure I get the correct 1/2 inch seam allowance all the way around. So I'm just going to do that here. We have finished sewing around the entire top of the bag, and I'm just going to go back to where I started with the back stitch at the beginning and the end here, and I'm going to open up the stitching just within those few stitches along here, and you can see that by doing a row of stitching by finger pressing this section down, when I unpick it, it's going to give me a nice crease to give me a nice even edge to close up the top of the bag. So I'll just unpick those few stitches there. Once you've made your opening wide enough, then you can turn everything the right way around. And with the Decaville, this is going to be quite stiff, so you do need to have quite a large opening when you're using a really stiff stabilizer. Once you've turned everything the right way around, we need to top stitch. So what we're going to do is clip all the edges down so that they sit nice and flat and that the lining actually sits inside the bag. And where the opening is here, we will find that fold that we've got in the opening, and that will sit directly on the edge there of the piping, so we can go back and top stitch all the way around. Okay, the edges have been clipped together. What we can do now is take this back to the machine. We're going to top stitch, and we'll top stitch the handle so that it sits up and not flopping down. So we're just going to go about 1/8 of an inch all the way along the edge of the fabric there. Once we've done this, we're completely finished. So there we have our finished product. We've got a storage tub or basket with handles. If you wanted to, you could actually make some dividers on the inside and use this as a coffee cup carrier. I think that'd be a brilliant idea. Bread rolls, you don't have to put the handles on at all. I think the piping is a nice decorative little feature on the bag. What do you think? And remember that big mistake that I made where I'd cut my fabric? That's in along here somewhere. I don't actually know, you can't tell. So the seam that I've had to repair is on the inside there. Don't know which side it is, so that's fine. Nobody will ever know I mucked up. I didn't quite get to finish making this project on the vintage machine. It got too hard on my shoulder, so I had to go and change to my industrial machine. It goes a lot faster. The lighting was much better over in this corner as well. So I do apologise that I couldn't finish it all on the one machine. But here we go. This is the finished basket with the piping around the edges and on the edge of the handle there. I don't really know what we would use this for. I think it would be perfect at Easter time. It's a great basket to have for an Easter egg hunt. And if you don't put the handles on it, it'll make a great bread basket for the dining table as well. So I'm thankful that that big mistake I made in cutting my fabric wrong hasn't shown up. I'm going to use this for myself anyway, so it's not a problem, but I'm really happy with the way this has turned out. Decaville is a little bit more challenging when you're trying to turn your bags through, so if you have access to Peltex, which is a little bit softer to use but still gives you good stiffness, that's a nice one to work with. I find the Decaville to be very, very rigid, but it's a great stabiliser when you do want something nice and solid like this. Anyway, I hope you've enjoyed this video, and I shall catch you next time. Bye for now.